The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Welcome to Liberty Nation. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America and host of the Three Martini Lunch podcast, sitting in for Tim Donner this week. Got a very full hour for you. Today we'll be joined by former federal prosecutor Andy McCarthy, who will explain the connection between Joe Biden and the Black Lives Matter organization and how their real goals in this movement are far more sinister than winning any election. Also, we keep hearing from the left and their media friends that mail-in voting and absentee voting are the same thing. Oh, no, they're not. We'll discuss the differences and why they matter with Commissioner Don Palmer of the Election Assistance Commission. And we'll talk with LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza about 3 legal issues in the headlines this week impacting your freedom, 2 of which will actually make lovers of liberty smile, and one that almost redefines ridiculous. But first, the Biden deception tour rolls along. It was bad enough that Joe Biden and the Democrats could not find one sentence in their convention to admit the destruction going on in American cities. But when it started showing up in polls the week of the Republican convention, Biden suddenly pretended he had condemned the violence all along. At best, he had given it the attention of a sentence fragment a time or two over the previous 3 months. But 2 weeks ago, when the numbers were heading south, Biden suddenly creaked into action in an attempt to jump in front of the parade. He then tried some verbal sleight of hand by saying Trump is actually responsible for the violence, even though with rare exceptions, it's all coming from the far left. Biden saw nothing worth denouncing forcefully until his own political life was on the line. Some courage. This is nothing new from Biden. He's the same guy who called the president xenophobic for instituting the travel ban on China, and then later saying he supported it all along. It's the same absurd strategy he employed by insisting students and teachers could not safely return to school. And to even suggest such a thing was irresponsible. Now he says they should be back in school, but Trump's poor leadership makes that impossible. But we know Biden was simply in the pocket of the teachers' unions who did not want to be back in the classroom. And when the NEA and American Federation of Teachers say to jump, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and most Democrats simply ask how high. But the unions aren't done, not by a long shot. They're ready to leave the virtual classroom too and take to the streets, where there's not really a threat of COVID infection because the cause is so just. The Associated Press had the story earlier this week when they reported, quote, ahead of Labor Day, unions representing millions across several working class sectors are threatening to authorize work stoppages in support of the Black Lives Matter movement amid calls for concrete measures that address racial injustice. In a statement first shared with the Associated Press, labor leaders who represent teachers, auto workers, truck drivers, and clerical staff, among others, signaled a willingness Friday to escalate protest tactics to force local and federal lawmakers to take action on policing reform and systemic racism. They said the walkouts, if they were to move forward with them, would last for as long as needed. Oh, but they do have demands that could get them to call this off. They would want to, quote, divest from the police, redistribute the stolen wealth of the billionaire class, and to invest in what our people need to live in peace, dignity, and abundance: universal health care, universal public housing, public jobs programs, and cash assistance, and safe working conditions. So, the political operatives masquerading as public servants aren't even masquerading anymore. They're avowed agitators trying to tear down the system. And this could backfire on Biden and the Democrats spectacularly. But even if it doesn't, Biden has a lot to answer for here. He's been aligned with these people for 50 years, and he's pandering to them right now. Why has he been so silent on the violence? What actual solutions does he have for police interaction with suspects of any color? Why does he want to declare war on charter schools, even though he now says he doesn't? Why is he suddenly for taxpayer-funded abortions? Why is he all over the map on fracking? The real answer is that Joe Biden just drifts to the place he thinks is safest politically. He has very few core principles, and he needs to be called out on those and many others. The media is not going to do it. They're too busy giving him a wet kiss every time he trudges to a microphone. I'm not a political consultant, but the only place this confrontation has any chance of playing out is on a debate stage. A moderator might ask him a slightly challenging question or two, but the only one who can actually call him on the carpet on all this is Trump. And that's why I think Republicans and the Trump campaign are making a colossal error in the lead up to the debates. For some inexplicable reason, the Republicans keep predicting Biden will stumble and bumble incoherently throughout the debates, and maybe he will. But when you lower the bar to the point where not drooling constitutes a good night for Biden, he doesn't have to do much more than show up. If the expectation becomes that Joe Biden has a mountain of falsehoods and flip-flops and inconsistencies to explain, and he better have convincing explanations, then all of a sudden there's some pressure on Biden. And then insufficient answers or incoherent ones stand out a whole lot more when viewers come in with raised expectations. But time's wasting. If you want Biden to crash and burn at the debates, you better start setting the narrative now. Okay, let's step away for just a moment. Still to come on Liberty Nation, we'll look at the latest legal headlines impacting your freedom, and we'll dig into mail-in voting fact and fiction, and ask whether we should be concerned that some states are already saying there will be no election results for days come November. But up next, Andy McCarthy joins us to discuss the Biden Black Lives Matter connection and how it threatens your First Amendment rights. Stay with us.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Thanks for being with us this week. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America and the Three Martini Lunch podcast, sitting in for Tim Donner this week. Still to come in this edition, we'll separate fact from fiction on absentee versus mail-in voting with Commissioner Don Palmer of the Election Assistance Commission. We'll also examine 3 legal issues in the news that impact your freedom, from virtual schooling to the government's pursuit of your private information, to your rights with respect to TSA screenings, and really your interaction with most government personnel. But first, as we discussed in the opening segment, the ongoing unrest in the streets of America's cities continues to be of great concern to the American people. So much so that the Democrats actually started acknowledging the existence of this violence within the last couple of weeks. But while sometimes condemning violence of any kind, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are trying to pin the unrest on President Trump and his supporters, either for allegedly causing the violence or for inciting the far-left demonstrators who otherwise would never have supposedly destroyed, looted, pillaged, or assaulted everything in their paths. So, what exactly is the Biden strategy here? With me now to explain what's really at work is Andrew C. McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He's also a contributing editor and columnist at National Review Online and a Fox News Channel contributor. Andy is also the author of Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Reagan Election and Destroy a Presidency. And recently, he's the author of a column on National Review Online entitled It's a Straight Line from Biden to BLM, meaning Black Lives Matter, of course. And Andy, thanks very much for being with us.
Greg, it's my pleasure.
Well, this column came out a couple of days after Biden's speech in Pittsburgh, where he finally denounced the violence in the streets at a length beyond a sentence fragment. But amazingly, he blamed President Trump and Trump supporters rather than far-left groups like Antifa, Black Lives Matter, Inc. It's a kind of an amazing pivot from pretending the riots were not happening at all. You contend in the column that Biden is essentially setting up a situation that targets free speech to the point that any condemnation of the far-left demonstrators is ultimately blamed for their criminal activity. So how does this logic work?
Well, it's known in a lot of First Amendment jurisprudence, Greg, as the heckler's veto. And it's the idea that if I say something provocative and you react irrationally with violence, the culprit in the equation is me, because I offended your tender sensibilities, not you because you couldn't control yourself. And while that seems to be a very juvenile approach to free speech in a free society where we're supposed to endure ideas that make us uncomfortable, it is the approach to speech that was prevalent in the Obama-Biden administration, where back in, I want to say circa the 2010 to 2012, they joined with a number of Islamist regimes to promote a United Nations Human Rights Council resolution, which was known as Resolution 1618, that purported to prohibit speech that could cause incitement to hostility. In other words, speech that would make people feel uncomfortable. And what it was particularly geared toward was what in the 1990s, as a prosecutor, I used to refer to as evidence. Evidence. So just to make it stark, when I was a prosecutor doing a terrorism case in 1995, if I got up in a courtroom and said, there are these bellicose verses in the Quran, and they literally are urges to violence. There's no disputing that. And when they are mediated by radical imams or influential Sharia scholars like the blind sheikh, who was the lead defendant in my case, they can activate young Muslims to commit acts of violence, and they do, in fact, do that. So it's a very linear progression from the verses to the mediation to the terrorism. If I got up in the courtroom in 1990 and said that, I was simply marshaling evidence and enforcing the law. If I said it under Resolution 1618, I would be violating the law by saying something that could cause, that could influence people to be hostile to Islam. That would be the interpretation of it. So in other words, the speech, which is core First Amendment political speech which is aimed at not only enforcing the law in criminal proceedings, but also in policy area, developing a national security policy to protect the country. So we're talking about speeches that is at the very core of free expression. The Obama-Biden administration purported to prohibit it, and it was doing so on a perversion of the idea of incitement. Incitement's a very simple idea that's older than our society. It basically is the idea that if I intend to rile you up to violate the law, and then I urge you verbally to do that, to either commit violence or lawlessness, I'm inciting you to violence. Their interpretation of it was, if I say things that upset you and you irrationally, even though I don't intend for you to do this, you irrationally erupt in violence, the guilty party is me. I have incited you. And they've obviously contorted this concept further to the point where your silence can be an incitement in some circumstances.
So let's follow up on that, because if your criticism of their preferred cause or preferred message is considered incitement, and your silence is obviously considered unacceptable also, what does this mean for the freedom of speech in this country, regardless, I guess, whether they win, because that's kind of the way the conventional wisdom is going right now?
Yeah, it means the freedom of speech disappears. And, it's fair enough to say, Greg, that the First Amendment has always been the citizens' protection against government action to suppress speech. But when it was pointed out in the Obama-Biden administration days that Resolution 1618 could not withstand even slight scrutiny under the First Amendment, it was blatantly unconstitutional. It was left, as I said in the column, to old reliable Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to go out and defend it. And she basically said that even if the law doesn't work here, we'll use old-fashioned peer pressure and shaming and whatever we need to do in order to show people that they can't say and do things of which we disapprove. So that's what you're seeing on the streets today. I mean, basically, the idea, once you start to say, peer pressure and shaming, it's a very short hop to extortion, which is what we now are seeing in the streets. So it's a combination of government officials and activists out on the street, which are making it unsafe, not just to say things, but as you just pointed out, to not say things, and essentially to be part of a political opposition that they find provocative.
Well, it'd be bad enough if one part of the First Amendment were under withering assault right now, and there's probably more than two, but obviously the press seems to be going along with this in large part as well, certainly the mainstream media, where you see virtually no condemnation of Antifa or Black Lives Matter, capital letters, and what they're doing in the streets. It's almost like the media and the Biden campaign and a lot of voices on the left are all in sync, which I'm sure is not an accident. But just to build this even further, what happens when not only free speech, but free press is basically under the thumb of this?
Yeah, well, the thing is, and it's funny because the left used to remind us of this, particularly when they were in the minority at various times in modern history, that you have to have free expression in order to be a functioning democracy in a free society. If you don't allow the robust exchange of ideas, including ideas that you don't want to hear, then you can't arrive at the best policy and the most rational policy and the policy that actually leads to real progress and to prosperity in the society. So I think it's a very short-sighted tack for the media to take, and it bespeaks not only a lack of historical understanding and civic education, but a lack of what they need for self-preservation. Because if these are going to be the rules, extortion can be turned on you as easily as you can use it as a weapon. And it's one of the reasons that we like to think of ourselves as a rule of law society that doesn't put up with that kind of thing, no matter who wants to be the extortionate force.
Is Biden now leading this parade since he's said what he said and he's the Democratic nominee, or is he really hanging on to the rear bumper of this movement by his fingernails?
Yeah, I don't know if you want to call it leading from behind or leading by leading by cue cards. He is going to be a very powerful person if he's elected. We can all either in sadness or in a jocular way note that he's not the guy he used to be. I mean, there's obviously, and look, we all slip a step at a certain point, but he's not, he doesn't have the acuity that he had at one time. I never thought he was particularly acute myself, but he's going to be a very powerful person if he's elected. So I don't think that even if we think that he's very managed, which he seems to be in this campaign, we shouldn't underestimate if he's got the reins of power, what he can accomplish and what direction he will take the country in.
Andy, troubling stuff to say the least, especially in a country that cherishes its freedom. Let's hope that cherishing of freedom continues. Thanks very much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg.
Andrew C. McCarthy is a former chief assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. He is now a contributing editor and columnist at National Review Online and a Fox News Channel contributor. His latest book is Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Coming up on Liberty Nation, we'll examine legal headlines with LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza, including a distance learning nightmare and how you may be on the brink of winning a lot more freedom against the TSA. But up next, separating fact from fiction on absentee and mail-in voting. Stay with us.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America and host of the Three Martini Lunch podcast, sitting in for Tim Donner. My guest at this time is Don Palmer. Don is a commissioner with the Federal Election Assistance Commission. He has also overseen elections in Florida and Virginia, but for the record, he was not running the 2000 election in Florida. Don is also the host of the VoteCast podcast, explaining how elections are run and secured, how the vote counting is done, and how to make sure you are an eligible voter. Today, we want to get Don's insights on some of the stories we're seeing in the final 2 months of the 2020 campaign about mail-in balloting and what we can expect with the method and timing of vote counting come November. And Don, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks for having me on.
Well, let's start with the debate that's been going for months now, especially since we've been coming to the realization that this election is going to take place in some form or fashion while we're still in a pandemic. On the one hand, you've got those who say mail-in voting and absentee voting are two different terms for the exact same thing. Others say, no, it's a huge difference because of how the applications or the ballots are sent out. What's the fact? What's the fiction? And is there really a big difference?
There is a difference. Universal mail balloting, 5 or 6 states do that, where everybody who's on the voter registration rolls will receive a ballot. Those ballots will be sent on election day or for the election. When you're talking about absentee, no excuse absentee, or excuse absentee, you're able to receive that ballot, but it's pursuant to a request to the election office. Otherwise, you will be expected to vote early at an early voting site or election day. So that is the big difference. And I think that many integrity folks appreciate the fact that a voter who wants to vote by mail or absentee would request that with their current address and a confirmation of their identity. And many states have determined that they feel comfortable with that. In fact, I believe it's about 40 states have no excuse absentee voting. And again, like I said before, there was probably 5 or 6 states. Now there's going to be a few more that will have universal mail balloting. So that is the big difference between the two.
So, Don, some states have pretty much statewide mail voting. Washington, Oregon, and I think Colorado's been doing more of that recently. There's also been a lot of focus on Nevada, for example, which doesn't normally have that, but is planning to do it in this situation. So what's your insight on doing it specifically for this occasion?
I think the voters are sort of moving in that direction. Particularly, there's the fear of the pandemic and whether or not the virus will impact them. And we have to recognize that many voters are going to take advantage of the opportunity to request a ballot. Now, you mentioned Nevada and some of the states that are moving for this election to universal. I think those states and those legislatures made the determination that, look, let's just mail it to every voter and call it a day. Let's just go ahead and make that change. Many of the Democratic legislatures made that decision. On the other hand, many states, Republican legislatures, feel that they like the integrity of in-person voting. And they also feel that the pandemic has been mitigated to a point, particularly with CDC guidelines, that people will be able to vote safely in person.
What do we know about security when it comes to universal mail-in? In other words, when the state initiates rather than the voter initiating. You've got a lot of folks worried. I think President Trump has suggested this, that with voter rolls not necessarily completely up to date, you could have ballots being sent to residences where the voter no longer lives or where people are no longer alive even. So is it ripe for mischief, or are there protections like signatures and things that are in place where it can be secure regardless of the method that the ballots get sent out?
Yes. For universal mail balloting, there are a number of procedures as security procedures. And one that includes, for example, signature verification, using that signature on the ballot affidavit and comparing it to the signature from a registration perspective. Also, there will be sort of a ballot tracking system in place where a voter can go on and track their ballot, and the election official can do the same. Because mail balloting or absentee balloting, it is a form of voting away from the polling place. Many states feel that they need additional measures to increase the integrity of that process because it's inherently less secure than voting in person, where you would arrive in person, show your ID to an election official, and vote on a tabulator or a piece of voting equipment. So many states do allow mail balloting by absentee or absentee request. They see that as an additional security measure, whereas the 5 or 6 states that we mentioned before, I think Hawaii was added to the change. This will be their first election all mail as well. Those states have determined that they believe that they have enough security measures in place to secure that mail balloting process.
So you're confident that even with a large influx of mail-in balloting, that the provisions are in place, that we can trust the results, and that there hasn't been harvesting or mischief behind the scenes that could taint the actual intent of the voters getting these ballots?
Well, a lot of what we do is voter confidence. And, there have been some issues with voter fraud. I think the primary issue that we see with a lot of mail balloting is the error rates. And the error rates have gone up, particularly for those states that are doing this for the first or second time. And when the voters are voting by mail for the first time, a lot of mistakes can be made if you don't pay attention to details. You may not really understand the calendar when it comes to the Postal Service. And so what you see and what you've seen across the country is you've seen error rates where voters don't have their ballot counted. And so one of the advantages that a state like Oregon or Washington has is that they started this process of moving to all-mail voting over a decade ago. And so it's given both the election officials, the post office, and the voter the opportunity to become accommodated to this form of voting. So what you see in the rest of the country is this compressed learning curve where they understand that there's going to be increased mail voting. We're trying to educate the voter that if this is your first time or you're not an expert or professional doing this, that you need to understand that you need to get your ballot in early. There may be options on returning it to the election office or to a drop box, but they're trying to compress this learning curve over 1 year or a cycle versus multiple elections over a decade in some of the Western states that have all-mail voting.
Let's talk about election night and the ballot counting here. We hear that it's not necessarily going to be election day or election night. It's going to be election week. Michigan, for example, said could be days before we actually have results. And of course, it's possible that the in-person returns come in on that Tuesday night, and then the mail-in votes come in with a different result, which will have a lot of folks wondering if they can trust the count, I guess. We've heard that from both sides of the political spectrum. What protocols are in place in most states, Don, to make sure that counting in-person and absentee votes go smoothly and accurately?
The counting of ballots is a process, for example, that will include, in-person on election day plus early voting if applicable. You'll also have those mail ballots or absentee ballots that have come in over the weeks prior to the election. And what the election official will do, they'll canvass those and they'll collect those results and then provide those to the public and to the state on election night. And so that is a process that takes place. If there are a large number of absentee or mail ballots that arrive on election night or after, it could delay the results. And I think one of the issues in Michigan is they are moving to no excuse absentee for the first time ever. And they anticipated there would be some increase simply because of that new law. Then with COVID and the population moving in that direction, if it's available as an option, they have laws in place that don't really allow for the canvassing of those ballots, which really means just making sure you can open the envelope. You may even tabulate it, but not display the results. None of that in Michigan can occur until election night. And so in a lot of states like Florida, I believe North Carolina, you're going to have some significant results for election day and early voting that you can see the number of ballots that have been counted and what the initial results are. But in Michigan, there may be a problem because they may not get started till election night, and that could delay it for a couple of days. The one thing that I always tell folks is we've been frustrated as election officials because those election results are often, what you're seeing on TV is often projections on who's going to win based on a small amount of ballots. That can actually change. And I think we saw a little bit of that in 2016 based on what the projections were. And then suddenly the results were a little bit different than the exit polls and what projections were. So I think what you'll find is that we won't have results by midnight. And I think that it will all determine on what are the actual official results that are coming into precincts and from the early voting sites. And so I think by Wednesday and Thursday, we should have a really clear sense of who the winner is.
A lot to watch. You're going to be a busy man, as are a lot of those election officials the next 60 days or so. Don, thanks very much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg.
Don Palmer is a commissioner with the Election Assistance Commission. For more information on them, you can go to eac.gov. Don has overseen elections in Florida and Virginia, and he's also the host of the VoteCast podcast, which you can get wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Straight ahead on Liberty Nation, the latest legal issues and rulings impacting your freedom. 2 of them are actually good. One may give you more rights as it pertains to the TSA and other government personnel, and the other protecting your private data. But we'll also be talking about a student suspended for having a toy gun while distance learning. That's up next. Stay with us on Liberty Nation.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
This is Liberty Nation. I'm Greg Corombos, sitting in for Tim Donner this week and next week. And for the next few minutes, we're going to look at some of the most important legal headlines regarding your freedoms, courtesy of Scott Cosenza, legal affairs editor at libertynation.com. Scott, good to be with you again.
Hi, Greg.
Let's start with one of the things that I think drives just about every parent nuts, at least the ones with common sense. And this is a story out of Colorado Springs, Colorado. It's not the first time we've seen zero tolerance with guns in schools go crazy, but this is at a new level because now, of course, we're doing distance learning, right? Isaiah Elliott is a 12-year-old boy who lives in Colorado Springs, and he likes his neon green Nerf gun. What boy at 12 years old doesn't? And it has the words Zombie Hunter written on it. Last week during a virtual classroom session, Isaiah briefly picked up the gun, causing it to appear on screen for just a few seconds, got noticed by his teacher, who promptly alerted the authorities, and as a result, police paid a visit to Elliott's home, and the school suspended him for 5 days, even though the teacher was fairly certain the gun was a toy. I would think the words Zombie Hunter emblazoned on it would be one of the quickest giveaways on that. We've seen this with kids chewing Pop-Tarts into the shape of a gun or making the image of a gun with their thumb and their index finger. The absurdity doesn't seem to stop. So what legal recourse does the family have here, and do the schools really have here?
Oh, that's a lot. There's a lot to chew on there, Greg. Let's say the family, and this is the Elliott family of Colorado Springs, Colorado. They have done what I think is the best thing possible for a family in this circumstance, Greg. They've simply removed young Isaiah Elliott from the Widefield School District public schools and enrolled him in a charter or private school. Only families with, the resources available to do that can make that happen for themselves. But that, I think, is the best thing, to get these government people out of your kid's life, because they say things like, and this is the official statement from the school district, as preposterous as it is, that safety is always our number one priority. Now, how does sending police officers to young black males, by the way, doorsteps with reports of guns, when we know for sure it's a toy gun, it's kind of beyond the pale, right?
If this were to actually be challenged, can the school just make these rules and enforce them?
As long as they're not lying, any person can call the police on any other person, right? There's certainly laws against lying to the police about what somebody else is doing. But if the teacher truthfully says, I saw an object, I think it was a toy, but I don't know for sure, that can happen. The problem is that the police are in this position where if they don't check it out and something goes wrong, then they're the ones that are blamed. So I think critical thinking on the part of the school's behalf would be a welcome intervention in this process. But if that's not the case, and you are that family, the best thing that you can do when you're interacting with the police, if they suspect you of committing any kind of crime or violation, is simply to say nothing and assert your right to be represented by counsel. That's a great rule in almost every instance. It's one of the few that does apply almost universally, Greg.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the government loves being the nanny state. We see that, right? And obviously public schools are government-run institutions. But
Greg, in this story, the family also learned that, unbeknownst to them and all the other parents in the district, that the school district was recording these Zoom sessions. So it's recording not only the students themselves, which is a new thing altogether, right? But also what happens in the family room and goes on behind the student. So the invasiveness, and problems that it presents for liberty are just getting started.
All right, let's talk about the government in another way here, and whether or not the federal government can get access to cell phone numbers from Google. Federal courts in the Chicago area have 3 times now rejected government applications for warrants to force Google to produce a list of smartphones near 2 particular commercial establishments during one of 3 45-minute intervals. The most recent ruling was handed down last week and was recently made public. The decisions are significant because Google has reported massive growth in law enforcement use of such geofence searches. Google says there was a 1,500% increase between 2017 and 2018, and another 600% jump from 2018 to 2019. So that's a 100-fold increase in just 2 years. So, Scott, how do we read this? Right now, we know there's a lot of people kind of evading the law in some of these urban areas that perhaps law enforcement would be interested in tracking down if they're guilty of looting and rioting and so forth. On the other hand, you don't want the government to have access to this information without really good cause. So how do you approach this one?
Well, to be clear, Greg, the Fifth Amendment and other protections that frustrate government attempts to look wherever and whenever they please do frustrate attempts to discover who may be guilty of a crime. And the founders, and certainly I agree with the founders, have said that they also prevent impermissible impositions on our liberty. And so the constitutional requirements for a search under the Fourth Amendment have what's called a particularity clause, which is that the persons or things to be seized by the search must be identified with particularity. You can't say some guy in the south side of Chicago who has a phone. That's sort of the level of specificity that the authorities have asked for with this geofencing, which is this new term that describes this kind of a search. They identify a particular geographic areas, and then they go to Google and say, we want every single subscriber data point that you can give us within this certain geographic area at this certain time. I think this is a powerful pro-liberty ruling. We'll have to see if, as it continues up through the federal courts, I imagine at some point reaching the Supreme Court, if we continue to see the ones that bolster liberty rather than government intrusion on it.
Speaking of grinding against Americans' liberty, figuratively and literally sometimes, let's talk about the TSA. Everybody loves going through security at the airport, although fewer people have been doing it the last few months here. You got to go through the scanner with your hands up like you're the suspect, and then you come out the other side, and you also have the option for the pat down, which is always pleasant. But a panel of the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals decided that TSA checkpoint agents or transportation security officers are liable for damages if they commit assault, battery, or certain other torts against travelers. The story here is that a guy named Brian Iverson went through security at Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport. He was on crutches. He went through and they were doing a search, and they said he couldn't put weight on the crutches, but he could put his hands on top of them. And he says that the agent suddenly moved away. He fell over. He got further injured, and therefore he launched this case against the TSA. So what's the long-term impact of this case, and how wide-ranging do you think the impact is?
I think it is exceedingly wide-ranging, Greg. I really can't. If this ruling stands, it's a big ruling. The federal government generally enjoys sovereign immunity from lawsuit. And what that means is if some component of the federal government does something that you didn't like or you think violates your rights, you generally cannot sue them. And that's because they enjoy this sovereign immunity. Now, there are certain laws where they have said they will be subject to suit. Tort Claims Act basically says that if you're an agent of the U.S. government and you do violate someone's rights, then you can be sued. And so that's what this litigation is about. If TSA agents can come under that umbrella, then people who are abused by them, in this case, physically abused with the crutches by Mr. Iverson, well, that's how he can get into court to process his claim. If they're not ruled that way, the current civil liability law at the federal level says that they cannot be sued. As outrageous as that may sound, that is currently the law in some places in America and not others. So we have what's called a split in the circuits. The Third and Eighth Circuits now, as you report, say that they can be sued. The 11th Circuit says they can't be sued. I think clearly, Greg, this is going one place, the Supreme Court. And in terms of the impact, given how many times the TSA searches and touches Americans, even in a COVID-19 shutdown world, on a daily basis, you can see the potential impact going forward.
Scott, always great to have you with us. Thanks for looking at these big cases with us, and you and I will talk again next week.
Thanks, Greg.
Scott Cosenza is Legal Affairs Editor at LibertyNation.com. That does it for this edition of Liberty Nation. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America and host of the 3 Martini Lunch podcast, sitting in for Tim Donner. Please visit LibertyNation.com and keep standing up for liberty.